Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Terry Friedman. I'm the sort of treasurer of this band of bandits. But that means I have to deal with figures all the time, and some figures are project figures. Now, we'll get to the meeting tonight in a minute, but before we start, there are no health and safety announcements. There's no coffee, no tea, no wine, no biscuits. But we do have events coming up, such as on the 25th of October is the AGM, Disrupting Project Management. Are you ready? And on the 17th of November, another meeting, which is Project Management as a Career. That's the announcements for this particular group. I'm sure Julian will have something to say about project management as well, in terms of data management. Now, to start with then, we're going to have an excellent talk from Julian, whom I know because I'm also treasurer of his group, Data Management. And so we get on together very well, which is nice. Now, what is it about figures and maths and statistics that guides your project to a successful close? We want to keep things as clean as possible, and I'm sure that I have a lot to learn, as you do. And I'll introduce you now, Julian Schwarzenbach, the chairman of the Data Management Specialist Group. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Terry. Yes, so as Terry said, I'm chair of the Data Management Specialist Group. I've also been involved in data management activities for most of my career, which is a fairly lengthy career now. And a lot of that time I've been both on the client side of the fence, and for the last 15 or so years I've been working more on the consultancy side of the fence. So I've seen different perspectives, and what I'm going to be doing tonight is just sharing some of the insights there, really. And the title of tonight's talk is really about project data analytics. Doesn't happen by accident. So it's taking a data slant to what you might need to do about understanding how your project is behaving and what you're expecting your project to do. So without further ado, we'll dive into that. So I say I've been involved in a number of pretty large projects and programs across different organizations, and I'm going to touch on those a little bit throughout the session tonight. We will be having questions at the end, and you type your questions into the question box on the GoToWebinar console. And also there's going to be a little prize for the question that I think is the best for generating debate, or somebody who's shown they've been paying attention to what I've been saying. So what I'm going to be covering tonight is really 4 particular areas. So firstly, it's just thinking about the nature of the data asset. What is it that we're dealing with, and why is it such an interesting beast to work with? Think a bit more about data quality and the people side of data quality, because it is very much a people-based issue. Also thinking through in terms of ISO 8000 as a framework to give you a better way of managing data quality management. And then finally, just going through and just posing a few questions, which would be interesting to get some responses from people in the audience there about what the impacts are on your project data analytics, of understanding where your project is and what it's doing. So as a start point, a couple of projects could have been great successes, but actually they didn't turn out to be such a successful one. So first one on the left there is Brandenburg Airport in Berlin. It was due to open in latest forecast date for opening is later this year, but I think that's going to be delayed yet again. It was due to open in 2011, and it was literally a week or 2 before the airport was due to open. They started to find problems with it, and the problems grew and grew, and hence you get the headline about 500,000 faults. And the image on the right is in Finland. It's Olkiluoto, if that's pronounced right, 3 reactor. And that's now about 12 years behind schedule. And one of the problems, or one of the things I'm going to get to tonight, is the fact that a way of minimizing and reducing the risk of such eventualities is actually trying to get on top of your project data, so you actually understand what is happening with your project. So that's a little bit of the background. So firstly, let's start thinking a bit more about the data asset, because it is an asset that most people work with. You'll have many organizations talk about treating data like an asset. So maybe you ought to think about, well, what do we mean? What sort of asset would we consider when we're talking about data as an asset? Is it perhaps like a medieval castle that's been here for hundreds of years? It's pretty robust. It's stood up to quite a few sieges, and it's basically it exists with only minimal maintenance to keep it going. Possibly not, because I think data is a little bit more like a sandcastle, where if you think about each grain of sand as being an individual bit of data, the configuration of all the sand grains as the sandcastle is what has value. Similarly, all the data working together, that's what has value to your organization. But a little bit like a sandcastle, data is fragile. There are many things that go on that can degrade your asset. There could be processes and things that might make it fall apart or whatever. And so it's something that needs a fair amount of careful management. If you also think in terms of, sorry, Terry, do you want to go on mute because you're getting background noise there? If you think about any particular business activity, there's a number of different aspects that you need to think about. And this, although this is talking about business activity, it also applies to projects the same. So in theory, you've got a strategy, you should have some governance in place to make sure the business activity works as intended. But then there are 4 key things that make up any particular business activity. Typically, you will have a process that's being followed, data that will be an input and an output from that process and potentially be changed by the process. You'll have the software systems that automate that process. And then finally, you'll have the people who are the actors in that system. For many organizations, a lot of the focus, a lot of the management time and the focus is spent on the software because it typically will have a name, it will typically have a large price tag with it. And therefore, focus is on we're upgrading such and such product, or we're implementing this ERP system. There's a lot of focus on that. And yet, one of the big challenges is people forget about the importance of the data. So if the data in your current systems is maybe less than perfect, and you're implementing a new software system, where's that going to get its data from? Well, it's going to be the data that you've currently got. And it's going to have to be migrated from your current systems into the new system. And that migration process may in turn introduce a lot of errors to the data, it may degrade the quality of the data. Even though you've got a brand new system being implemented in 3, 5, 10 years time, it's probably going to get replaced. And where is the replacement system going to get its data from? It's the data you've got now. So what you need to recognize and think about is the fact that the data that you've got in many organizational and many business contexts actually will outlive the software very significantly. And so it needs a much more of a balanced approach of management priorities and budget, thinking about the data as much as the software. You also need to recognize that data goes through a number of different life cycles. So if you're dealing with structured data, it might be inventory data, it might be project data, various things. It typically will go through a life cycle. You'll specify what you need. You might have a data feed coming in from somewhere. You might buy the data, or you might have people keying in data. You need to store it, utilize it, exploit it, which might then start to highlight some of the issues with the quality. You might improve the quality. If you've got gaps in your data, then you might use some form of synthesis to actually fill some of those gaps. And then ultimately you'll archive and delete it. Each of those steps in the process will be a chance both for the data to be further degraded, but also a chance for you to maybe discover yet more unwelcome things about the data that you've got if the quality isn't what you'd in fact hoped for. Similarly, for documents, they go through a slightly different life cycle, whether it's create, review and approve, store, publish and distribute, etc. But again, with documents, there is the metadata. All of that has got a quality implication, and you need to think through what does this mean. Each of these is a chance for the data quality to degrade. And particularly if in a project environment, there'll be a lot of documents that you're acquiring that will need storing and making available to the client at the end of your project. Therefore, you need to make sure that they can access and find what you've created and gathered. What you also should be trying to do is trying to, in effect, fit into a virtuous circle where if you can improve the quality of your data, then you improve the quality of the information, which means that you can make better quality decisions using that information, and then you get better outcomes, which in turn means if you've had a good intervention, then typically the data coming out of that will be fairly good. What you want to avoid is the downward death spiral where the data quality is poor, you can't trust the information, so you make bad decisions, which means you have bad outcomes, which then in turn leads to furthermore problems with your data. And you just don't want to avoid, you want to avoid that situation if you can. Something that I refer to quite a lot is something I term the data triangle, and these are the factors you need to think about in any data exploitation activities. And this is not just projects, but it's also about line of business activities as well. And just like a tripod, if you don't have all three legs, it's going to fall over. So if you're doing your data exploitation, you need to have three factors in place, otherwise your data exploitation actually isn't going to work. Firstly, you need to have some analytic tools, so you need to understand what tool set are we going to use. You need somebody who knows how to make it fly. So if it's, I don't know, business objects, Power BI, whatever, you need somebody who's a real expert at that system and knows how to make it work. You also need some subject matter expertise. So it's no good having the world's best Primavera expert if they don't understand your business, if they don't understand your project, if they don't understand the organizational context. So you need to marry those two together to allow you to get the data exploitation working effectively. But the final element that you need to make sure you've got sorted out is having data of known quality. Now, I'm not saying that your data has to be perfect, because in fact, you probably can't afford the time or the effort to get perfect data. But what you actually do need is to actually understand the nature of the quality of your data, so you can then start to make the right kind of decisions with it. So you need to recognize that the reasons why data is difficult to manage is that for many organizations, you actually have many data sources, as well as the official ones. There'll be all those lovely spreadsheets that people have got tucked away in folders all over the place. You'll have many business processes that all interact with the same data sources. You'll have lots of software systems. Some of those are going to be informal, or maybe third-party things that are living on a PC in the corner of somebody's room. There'll be many users who all work different levels of diligence. And also you'll have the impacts of what happened in the past. It may be you acquired an organization 5 years ago and their data was poor and you've never got around to sorting out the data. So that legacy of poor data is still there. So what you should be trying to aim for is to get a better approach to your data. So when we're talking about data quality, a good way of phrasing it or summing it up is really that good data is having the right data available at the right time to the right users to make the right decision and achieve the right outcome. Not much that you can disagree with there, really. But actually real world data, as I mentioned before, isn't perfect, and you couldn't afford to do that. So your challenge is to almost flip it on its head, accept that your data is never going to be perfect, and then work about how you actually describe the nature of the imperfection of your data. So let's do a little bit of an exercise. So normally, if I was in a room with you, I'd be able to do this physically, but at the moment, we're going to do this virtually. So imagine an asset. So you're part of a project, you're building an asset, or you're managing assets. So what I'd like you to do is first off, just build up a mental picture of an asset. I'm going to give you some data, and then let's start thinking about the quality of that data. So here's the data about the asset we're talking about. It's got an ID of 42. It's a piece of Duplo. So if any of you have got children or grandchildren, you will probably recognize what Duplo is. And so therefore it's got 4x2 studs, it's blue, got a length and a width. So question for you is, what's the quality of the data? Based on that, you would probably say, yep, that data is okay. I can't see any particular issues with that. What I'm now going to do, so sort of build that image in your head, think about what the object is going to look like. I'm now going to show you a picture of asset number 42. So now, what's your view of the quality of the data? Clearly, it's not blue. And this is one of the challenges that we've got, is that just because you have data, just because it's valid and plausible, doesn't actually mean it's right. And part of the challenge we've got around data quality is describing it in ways that make sense to people. One of the key things to do is to break it down. So a little bit like the weather, if somebody says the weather's bad, do they mean it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry? So if you're a farmer, you probably want some rain and some sun. If you're a holiday maker, you want sun but no rain. If you're a sailor, you want wind. So for different people, there's different understandings of what makes good weather. And similarly, in terms of data quality, you need to go through these different dimensions. So there's accuracy, timeliness, completeness, validity, consistency, and uniqueness to understand which of these factors we're talking about. And we'll touch back on those a little bit again. So just going back, you recall those project successes or not successes I mentioned earlier. And the challenge is saying, well, why should we bother? What's the purpose of doing this? Because it's just about dealing with ones and zeros. So one of the key things about thinking about why you need to think about data quality, why you need to improve it. It's all about efficiency. So actually, and this is a quotation from a 1980s quality management guru called Philip Crosby, and I've adapted it very slightly, so I added the word data in front of the word quality, but it gets across the message really, really clearly. So data quality is free. It's not a gift, but it's free. What costs money are all the unquality things, all the actions that involve not getting data quality right the first time, and all the actions to correct these data quality issues. So in fact, it is a efficiency, it's a profitability, it's a delivery issue. It is not about ones and zeros. It's not for the OCD people amongst us who are worried about the fact that something isn't quite right. This is about delivering what you're trying to do in the most profitable, efficient and effective way. And thinking about being efficient and effective, if you were to try and, if I was asking you to try and visualize the way your organization does data as a machine, what might that machine look like? It might look like this excavator and quarry, a big bit of yellow plant, very robust, can shift tons of rock at a time, can work effectively for many years, and shift many, many tons of rock. Or maybe you've got the Heath Robinson version of the same thing. It also excavates rock in a quarry. It has lots of levers, it has lots of ropes, it has lots of extra people pulling on levers and ropes to make it work. It's pulled by a donkey on a cart. Both of these shift rock. Both of these do the same job, but they've got hugely different levels of efficiency and effectiveness. Now, why am I using this example here? So if you think about most organizations, you've maybe spent a fortune implementing an ERP system and potentially the budget ran out partway through. So now there's a manual workaround on certain aspects. There's an interface with another system that never got finished off. So in fact, although you've paid for and your exec think you've got the piece of yellow plant, the reality is you're somewhere more towards the right, where you've got a few workarounds, a few manual processes, a few interfaces that don't work, that are actually adding to the inefficiency of the organization. And so what you need to do is actually need to start thinking about this a little bit more about how do we actually get ourselves more efficient? How do we get ourselves more robust? You may have heard, you may sort of ask people to say, well, do you trust your data? If you were to give your data a personality, do you think your data would trust you? Do you think it would actually trust you to look after it? Do you think it would actually should be happy that you were providing all the right data updates on time when you're expecting them so to actually work effectively? Do you think your data would trust you not to make multiple copies and update them separately so you don't have a single version of the truth anymore? Would your data, if it was sentient, would it trust you to migrate it to another data store? And so it's kind of a slightly unusual analogy, but it's just trying to get you to think a little bit more about, would your data actually trust you the way you treat it? Which now gets us on to thinking about the behavioral side of data quality. And it's an interesting thing. It's something so I'm less interested in the ones and zeros of data and far more interested in the people, the process and the behavioral aspects, because that's the bit that's endlessly fascinating. So if you think about people, how they interact with data or how they interact with other things, if you look at these different working environments on the left and on the right, which of these do you think are likely to be providing you with good quality data? The gentleman on the left and the office on the left, or maybe the working environments on the right? I mean, if you look at the left there, it's all neat and tidy. The three men you can see, they're wearing PPE. They look like they're having a reasonably polite conversation with each other. So chances are, if they're following the safety rules, the data that they're going to produce is going to be fairly coherent and it's going to be what you expect of it. Look at the working environments on the right-hand side. They're all pretty chaotic. They all look very haphazard. I'm not sure there's much care exerted in many areas. And you could then ask the question of, well, how good do you think the data will be coming out of those working environments? And chances are it probably wouldn't be that good. And this shows one of the things is that you have people who've got a compliant mindset and people who've got a non-compliant mindset. And what I mean there is that if you've got some of your team who are always late with their expenses forms and maybe try and slip a few extra items in, who are always late with the timesheets and maybe a bit creative in how they account for their time, those are the people who are also going to be creating problems with your data. They potentially are also going to be creating problems with the quality of the service and the quality of the transactions you've got with your customers, with your project activities. They may also be the people where you've got some health and safety problems. So those might be the people where you need to think, I need to focus not just on the data they're producing, but let's just check, are they following the safety rules? Are they following the right expenses, procedures, etc.? Another thing, thinking about data as an asset. If you think about, so I'm half Swiss, so I happen to like cheese. So if you think of this piece of Swiss cheese as a representing the data that you've got within your organisation, think about the fact that if you've got particular teams aren't providing updates based on the data, on the activities they've done, you've actually created another hole in your piece of cheese, another hole in your data. If there's somebody who's maybe brought in some services from external or third party who's not delivering the data in the right format, you've maybe got another hole in your data. If you've migrated data from another system, you've maybe got some more holes appearing. And so you go through and you get to the point where, whilst you still have an asset that's a piece of cheese, the number of holes you've got and then potentially the mold that's starting to appear on that cheese is at some point you get to a point where the cheese is no longer edible. Similarly, you get to a point where just because you've got a data set, you get to a point where it's no longer fit for purpose, and you need to be thinking about how do you make sure that you're looking after this data asset over time. One thing I do quite regularly is compare the approaches to data to those to health and safety. And one similarity is the fact that just like health and safety, data and data quality management, there's no one silver bullet that will, the one thing to do that will solve all your problems and everything magically work from there. It's about a sustained approach covering many, many different facets to actually help deliver what you're trying to achieve. There is a massive contrast between the two, and that's in terms of the feedback for when somebody does something wrong. In the world of health and safety, if you use the wrong tool for the job, it may well be that you're the person that gets the feedback is immediate and it hurts, so you know not to do it again. But in the world of data, very often, the people who are not filling in their cost sheets for what they're doing on a particular project activity, they're doing just the bare minimum. They're at home relaxing, watching the TV, having a beer, whatever, and you're the poor souls who may be trying to make sense of all this garbage they put in the system. So in fact, there's a massive contrast between the two. So the feedback for doing something wrong with data, typically the feedback loop is broken, so the pain is felt by not felt by the person who's done something wrong, and the pain is felt some way down the path. So there is no immediate incentive for somebody, unless you can actually create that feedback, there's no immediate incentive for somebody to say, actually, that's a bit of a pain, I'm not going to do that again. Also thinking about people and behavioural things, and again using safety as an example, makes you think about, in terms of from a data perspective, well, do we still have Victorian attitudes to our data? If you think about construction of the railways in the 19th century, very manual activity, safety records were particularly poor, there were a lot of fatalities, a lot of injuries. Each one of those fatalities was a tragedy, and yet each one of them was the view was, well, that's just the way things are, we can't change that, that's what it is, it's just kind of normalized. If you look now at current construction projects, and this is an example from Crossrail where they've had a step change in the safety performance, and it's been happening over a number of years, but Crossrail, in a number of the construction sites, they've gone 1,000 days plus without a lost time accident. They've got similarly amounts of time for about the last reportable accident. And the number of hours worked since reportable accidents is getting into the millions. So the world of health and safety has actually managed to take a view of, just because we have all these fatalities and injuries, it's not acceptable. Now think about most business contexts. If you've got people who maybe somebody spends half of Monday morning trying to pull together the performance figures from last week from half a dozen spreadsheets, that's viewed as, well, it's just a pain, but that's just the way things are with data. It's not necessarily viewed by many organisations as unacceptable, as something that should be changed. So it's unfortunate, but that's just the way things are. And part of the challenge I have is trying to convince people that it doesn't have to be this way. You can actually work differently. You can improve on that. Another aspect looking at this, and I'm only going to very quickly touch on this today, but there's a whole load of more information behind this, is a concept that we developed a number of years ago called the data zoo. And that looks at the generic behaviours that people exhibit towards data. And the way it's plotted out here is going along the horizontal axis is, what's the impact of these behaviours on the organisation? The vertical axis is then how well does somebody follow, how well do these behaviours follow the rules of the organisation, and the red, amber and green is sort of showing the strategic awareness within the organisation. And so some of the behaviours that you see there probably don't need too much explanation. So you've got the whinger, the person who's all too difficult, the old system was far better than the current one, don't see why we're doing it this way. Typically they're not very productive, but they don't create too many problems because they're not very productive. You then get the squirrel who's got their own sources of data tucked away all over the place that if you're in the center, you might not know about. The data anarchist who almost takes a perverse delight in whatever the company produces, they want to create a better version in Excel. You don't necessarily know about the squirrels and the anarchists because they're below the radar, they keep quiet about their activities, and yeah, they can be a real problem. Most people actually in the top, most behaviors at the top are in the useful bracket where doing a useful job, trying to do the right thing, and the idea of the data is really just to accentuate some of the differences. What you do need though is you probably need a combination of both the data evangelist, the person who's actually understood the power that good data and good data exploitation can deliver to an organization, has got a vision for where the organization could be, and the pod, the prophet of doom. If we don't improve what we're doing, the regulator is going to close us down within 6 months. If we don't improve what we're doing, we're going to get taken over by the competition. And those two behaviors actually work as a kind of a push-pull motivator on an organization to get people to change how they treat data. And so all of these here are behavioral traits. They're not personality traits. They're influenced by the organization that somebody is in. So if somebody's on their own, they will tend to work in a particular way. But as soon as you put them in a particular environment where their colleagues are behaving a way, or where the management of their organization behaves a certain way, that will drive behaviors in different ways. So the data zoo analogy and the concept I've described to many people over the years. And typically most people say, yeah, at different points in my career and different work situations, I've actually been most of those different behaviors. And so it just shows that it's all driven by the behaviors of the organization and the teams that people work in. So it's not personality traits. So therefore we can make a difference. Thinking organizationally as well, think about what are the things that might demotivate people from doing the right things with data. It may be that data isn't valued, or management either got poor, they've got tolerance of poor data, they don't question where data is, they just shrug their shoulders when there's been yet another data problem. And think about a project. If the data isn't trusted and nobody challenges that, then people think, well, actually, why bother? If changes are poorly communicated, if people are just getting one change after another, they get fatigued from that, and people just give up trying to change. And so there's a whole load of different demotivators there that can drive behaviors. And what you need to try and do is actually start getting people to move and behave a little bit differently. Just skip over that. We'll go into this one instead for the benefit of time. If you think about behaviors, they're actually driven by beliefs. And so therefore what we're trying to do is actually maybe change the beliefs that people have got. So if your belief is that speed cameras are just the government means to extract tax revenue from drivers, and that you're perfectly safe to drive at whatever speed you want on any road, you will behave a certain way, you'll drive a certain way. You will drive particularly fast and slow down for speed cameras. If on the other hand, your understanding is, your belief is that inappropriate speed is a safety issue, and the speed cameras are there much just to check everybody's behavior, you'll tend to drive slower, you'll tend to drive nearer the speed limit and probably not have to slow down each time you see a speed camera. So our challenge really is, how do we actually get some of these beliefs and get people to behave and believe a little bit differently? So some of the beliefs that we're trying to encourage is getting people to think about, make sure they understand that data is actually valuable to the organization. That good data quality actually improves profitability and efficiency, and in the case of projects, it actually is key to delivery in many cases. That everybody's got a part to play in improving it, and that any particular task or activity isn't complete until somebody's replied all the data. So it's not good enough just to answer the phone call from Mrs. Miggins that she's gone away and she's happy with her problem has been answered. You need to record what Mrs. Miggins' problem was and what was done about it. And also recognizing that all these things will take time. So improving the quality level for an organization actually will take us a huge amount of time. And so what you need to do is make sure you're demonstrating we're on that journey to improve how we do it. And one of the things that can help is actually taking more of an organizational approach to data quality management. And one of the standards that helps on this, so ISO 8000 is a suite of standards all related to data quality. And this one is a conceptual model from Part 61, which develops a process framework for the processes you should have in place to do data quality management effectively. I won't go into it in great detail. I'm just going to dip into a few areas, but it's basically based around the plan, do, check, act cycle, which is on the left-hand side, with the idea of getting some data related support, and there is some human resources and people aspects on the right hand side as well. And so some of the things, hopefully this will try and illustrate it a little bit more, is the fact that you actually need to have a clear set of data standards to work to. If you don't have clear standards, then you can have some problems. And here's an example from a well-known e-commerce site. Other sites are available. But if you look at the rows that are highlighted in red, they're all really good examples of where data standards would actually improved what you're after. So you take the top row, connectivity. We've got SATA, USB, yes, HDMI, lowercase, HDMI, uppercase, and yes. You look at the bottom one, another good example, response time, 157. 3 of them say 5 milliseconds, one says 8. What does that mean? And because they've not defined the standards they're after, not surprisingly, they're getting all sorts of interesting answers appearing in the data. So part of the challenge is making sure that you either have something called the data dictionary or something similar, where you've actually gone out and you've defined the information that the data that you're interested in for the organization. You need to explain, what does the entity, what does it relate to, what are the attributes, what do they mean? And so then when you're developing a set of data specifications, you need to make it very clear how everything fits together. So you might have a hierarchy of assets going from a site to a building activity to an entity and a component. You might have an entity that's a table, and that might be defined as it's a piece of furniture with a flat upper surface supported by legs or trestles, and it's got no more than one drawer underneath. It's got more than one drawer, it's a desk. If you've got a length, then length as an attribute, you need to describe it so people know what they're going to be measuring to record length. They need to know that you're recording length in millimeters and not meters or inches, perhaps. You need to know it's the longest dimension. We also maybe need to know the datum point, if it's not clear, where you're going to be measuring from and to. And so that's really, really key that you get that sorted out. What you can also do at the same time is create your data quality rules, your data quality criteria. So for example, in the table example here, if you know you're recording length in millimeters, then you can start to create a rule to look for invalid lengths, which might say, pick out all the ones that are below 500 millimeters and greater than 3000 millimeters, because that tells you somebody's either doing it in meters or they may be mismeasured or done something else wrong. So it's a really good start point, part of the same mental process. So now let's think about programs and where some of the data and the quality of the data starts to have an impact on programs. So here's 2 examples from my career. I won't say which organizations they are for fairly obvious reasons that will come through. One is a large investment program. It used one large commercial, sort of industry-leading project and program management platform for all the projects. All of the constituent projects have had all the plans within that platform, but there were few data specifications. The other one, large investment program within an organization. There was one bespoke project and program management platform for all the projects. All the constituent projects recorded all their key metadata within the platform. Detailed project planning was actually done outside the platform, but there were some consistent data specifications. So the 2 programs, the huge difference was the program on the left made it was extremely difficult to do any reporting, any analytics looking across the program. Whereas the one on the right, because all the metadata was recorded to a consistent standard, it meant that you could very quickly identify, for example, generate a look-ahead report. Which projects are due to start in the next 3 months? How many responsible officers of a particular level have been late on their program forecasts by more than 2 months? So you can start to do some program-wide reporting to actually give you a lot of information there about what's happening on the program. So just because you've got the same software platform, and the program on the left is a good example there, it's all done in the same platform, it's industry leading, but because they hadn't specified how they wanted the data recording, every project and program, every project within that program did it their own way. It's also important to think about your data processing activities are your leading indicators of data quality. So if somebody is not doing the right thing when they're recording the data about what they've just done, that is the data quality problem in the future. And it may be something you spot easily and quickly, or it may be something that has a long-term legacy. And a little bit like maybe a blacksmith making a horseshoe, you're trying to get it so it's a repeatable process that many people can do in the same way, rather than having each individual blacksmith maybe having their own little quirks about how they do the data processing. Everybody needs to do it the same way so you can trust that data. So going back to the data quality dimensions, the attributes I mentioned earlier, accuracy, does the data correctly represent the thing it's supposed to represent? Is your data set complete? Have you got all the attributes populated? Is your information about a particular employee, a particular project activity or a task, can it be consistently identified across different systems? Is your data up to date? Is it valid? If you're expecting numeric fields, are you getting numeric, or have you got some weird and wonderful alphanumeric characters in there? And is each entity recorded once and once only? Or do you have the same contractor who has maybe moved from different tier 3 suppliers, recorded 3 different times across your system? The bottom 4 of those, completeness, consistency, validity, and uniqueness, can be assessed and understood using data profiling tools, using software tools. Timeliness, slightly different checks needed there because you're checking out about process performance. But the key one, going back to the Duplo example from earlier, is accuracy. And data profiling tools cannot tell you anything about accuracy. Typically, it's the person standing in front of something that can tell you whether the data is accurate or not. So assessing accuracy is actually quite a difficult and can be expensive activity that also can have quite a few safety implications. You also need to, if you identified some of these problems, and look at root cause analysis, because what you want to try and do is take away the problems. It doesn't happen again. If you're trying to analyze every single data quality problem that you found, you might stop the whole organization. So your challenge is you need to pick up the high impact, high frequency problems. Definitely need to investigate those, work out the root causes and fix them. If it's high impact but low frequency, or low impact and high frequency, it's in the middle ground. It's worth investigating, but maybe not, don't go too far. And then the low impact, low frequency activity issues, only investigate those if there's a real burning need to do so. Just let them go by and deal with the bigger ones you've got. It's worth thinking through that in most cases, data errors, there's an element of human error in there. In some cases, in a few cases, it might be deliberate errors. Somebody who's deliberately, maliciously putting some bad data in the system. But in most cases, the errors are unintentional. It might be an execution error. So the thinking was right, but what was done was wrong. Or it might be a thinking error where wasn't the right thinking there either, because it's an unfamiliar situation that somebody doesn't know how to do it and they've guessed at it. Or maybe it's a familiar situation, but maybe somebody over the years maybe developed the wrong habits because learning from a colleague. And so these are some of the drivers for some of the data errors. And if you're doing some root cause analysis, and it might be something like activity job codes are incomplete or inconsistent, you can feed back, and using an Ishikawa diagram like this fishbone diagram here, what are the root causes? And it won't necessarily be one single root cause for a data quality problem. But if you can identify, for example, not only is there a problem with the training, but there's no refresher training, that's something that you can fix to make sure that it doesn't happen again, or reduce the frequency in the future. The technology issue could be that the prompts on screen aren't appropriate and they're actually leading people to provide the wrong information. So there's a whole load of root causes, and if putting those in, that actually helps you deliver improvements to data quality. You need to have some level of governance in there. So most projects and programs will have a level of governance, but they don't, for many organizations, governance is something that you do for a project. It might be doing something that involves expenditure. But within the data world, you need to think about governance being a business as usual activity that runs through the life of whatever you're doing. And there are various long definitions for data governance, but in fact, I tend to stick to a much shorter set of 4 here. So you should be defining, agreeing, and enforcing the rules. You should be looking to resolve issues as they arise. You should be looking to make sure, see, how well are we performing? Are we following the rules we're intending? And finally, there's looking at opportunities and threats. What's going on that we need to be aware of that we maybe need to respond to? And so if you've got your governance in place, you're starting to build some structure. If you don't have any data governance, then a little bit like a flag in the wind, you're just going to get pulled from pillar to post, you're going to get run ragged, you're going to end up in a right old state. So the things that you need to add into the model from ISO 8000 Part 61 is change management. Think about an escalation process, think about ethics, think about culture, and above all, having that governance board in place so they can actually monitor what's going on. Your escalation process should be trying to make sure that as issues get identified at the shop floor, at the front line, that they get escalated up to the right point in the organization to either agree that you're going to tolerate an issue, or that you're going to do something about it, or that you pass it further up the chain until somebody can make a decision on it. you need to have proper change management in place, because whilst some changes might not require any software changes, therefore there's no budget needed from the IT department, the implications might be quite far-reaching on the business if somebody says, rather than capturing this dimension to the nearest millimetre, we're going to capture it to the nearest tenth of a millimetre. Suddenly your measurement process changes massively. The costs go up hugely. No data changes, no software changes needed, but that change has actually made quite a big impact on the organisation. We talked about culture there, trying to think about how do you encourage the right behaviours. And one of the things to recognise is that you can't do all this immediately. So you're on a bit of a maturity journey, and this is one of the things that we do on a regular basis. We do assess the maturity of organisations against ISO 8000 to see where they are on the scale of innocent, they've never heard of it, they don't know what it is. Aware, they've heard of it, but they're not sure what to do about it. Developing, they're starting to put things in place. And so you get on until you get to the excellent thing. And it's part of a journey, and a maturity assessment can be a very powerful tool for helping organisations have that discussion about the areas of strength, the areas of weakness, and the things that you want to improve the next. So finally, let's think about sort of impact on project and project data analytics. If you're bringing in data from different data sets and you're trying to analyse them to understand where are we in our project or programme, then you might have a number of challenges that you might not think about. So going back to, and there's our Duplo block number 42s there again, but along with a load of other ones, you could ask the question, how many assets have we got here? One of those blocks is wooden. Is that an asset? Is it the same as the others? We've got a few that are joined together. Are they multiple assets or are they single assets? So if you don't have clear definitions, different stakeholders will have different understanding of what could be a relatively simple question. For some people, and some of the software vendors out there will come out and they will tell you all sorts of wondrous things about how technology will be the solution to all your problems. And depending on whether you've got a mostly complete jigsaw with one piece missing, or you've got a single piece with a lot of gaps around it, technology might not be a solution. So the idea of schema on read, it sounds very sexy, but if you've got data coming from different sources, if you've got allowable values that haven't yet been used correctly, schema on read isn't going to help you all that much. It may be using AI and machine learning to try and interpret the data, but if we go back to the point I made earlier about subject matter expertise, if you don't understand the data that you're looking at, then the quality of what the machine is producing for you is going to be quite questionable. There seems to be a current fad for creating a data lake, and if you bear in mind that data migration projects are some of the riskiest bits of software projects, the idea of a data lake of you day in, day out, migrating data through an ETL type process into a central store to analyze it, then your corruptions, your interesting features of the data might get quite prolific. So they can help in some cases, but they can create huge problems elsewhere. Similarly, the idea about doing some data washing, data cleansing, if you've not dealt with the root causes of the problems, somebody will sell you that software, they will sell you a service to actually tidy up your data. But if you haven't addressed the root causes, that's a continuing revenue stream for them, and they won't tell you about it because they want the revenue. Some of our data scientists, they're great, they're very bright, but in some cases they get carried away. Give them a million rows of data and they don't stop to think about what's the quality of that data. They might leap straight into thinking, what can I do with a million rows of data? You might miss the fact there's about 200,000 rows worth of that data is unreliable and can't be trusted, and there's 100,000 rows where the data is missing that was never gathered. So your data scientists, you need to think very carefully about that. If you think about extrapolating and interpolating from that data, if it's just filling in a small gap, then you can probably do that. But if you're trying to extrapolate too far, then the error rate is significantly higher than might be acceptable. So you need to think about the analytics you're doing. So what can you learn? What tools are you using to actually learn from your data? And most importantly is thinking about, back to the question earlier about the triangle there, of if you don't understand the quality of your data, any analytics that you do about your project and your program, there's going to be a real challenge there because you don't know the right questions to ask. Another aspect of security, another aspect of project data that you need to think very carefully about is security implications. And I've been involved in the development of a couple of the standards in the built environment around smart cities and BIM for security aspects. And these are things that, again, from a project, program, organizational perspective, that we all need to think about. And it's not just thinking about trying to prevent ransomware attacks or viruses, etc. What commercially sensitive information have you got? What information that's got intellectual property have you got that you might want to protect from the outside world? What information might allow somebody to do hostile reconnaissance? So this illustration here is Victoria Station in London. And early on in the project, somebody did a conference presentation where they used a graphic similar to this, showed a schematic, and somebody from the Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure was able to go down the tunnels using that image, put a chalk mark on the tunnels to show where he thought the comms cables were. He was a metre out. Now, if we're putting all this data and making it available to everybody, that's creating some huge risks for our organisations. So we actually need to approach this, as well as thinking from a quality mindset, we also need to have a security mindset in there to make sure we're doing things the right way. So finally, thinking about your project and your programme, these are questions you should be able to answer. So which of our project managers are late or bad at updating their project positions? What's our look ahead report? What projects have we got starting in the next 3 months? What projects have we got coming up to completion, and we therefore maybe need to put in some tighter monitoring to understand what's going on and are they on schedule or not? Are we all on schedule? What about budget? Money is the root of all of these things. So will we run out of budget? When will we run out of budget? By how much? So these are questions you need to be able to answer about your projects and your programs. If you're in a regulated environment, can you produce clear reports to the regulator? Are they defensible? Are they ones where if the regulator comes back and says, can you explain to me this number here, because I'm not sure I agree with it, you've got the data behind there. And in particular, if you've got delays, what are the conditions that lead to those delays? Is there something generic that you need to understand that you can actually say, actually, we've got a problem here, we need to get to the bottom of that, and we need to move forward and get a way of solving that problem. So those from a project perspective, and I mentioned earlier, I'm taking a data view of this, but those are some of the questions, some of the things that you might be thinking about from a project and program perspective, but you need to take through recognizing that to answer those questions uses data. The data quality might not be as good as you expect it to be. So just because there are numbers there, don't assume that the data is right. So what I've done really is I've just taken you through a quick canter through about the nature of the data assets, quality and behaviours, about using ISO 8000 as a framework to give you a framework for data quality management, for data governance, and that gives you a little bit of a view there. And finally, if there's something you want to find out a little bit more about all of this, there's a book that Tim King and I produced. Tim is the ISO 8000 convener, so he's the person in charge of pulling all the ISO 8000 standards together, and it covers a lot of the topics that we covered today, but in quite a bit more detail. Also, consultancy I work for, Data and Process Advantage, we've actually got a number of online courses, and there's a bundle of them called Managing Data Quality, not surprisingly, which means that most of those are available as online courses that are available for people to access as and when they want to. So that's the end of my presentation. Do you have any questions? I think Terry and Maurice, I think if you'll be answering the questions on behalf of the audience. So if you've got questions, if you type them into the question box, and then I'll answer them as best I can. And just reminding people that there is going to be a prize for the best question that we've got.
Right, can everyone hear me? It's very kind of Julian to offer the book that we normally offer to speakers to one of the audience tonight. And he's already mentioned Maurice's name. Maurice Farmer has given great support in running of this event. So I thank them both for that. Right, I'm not going to start with any questions. I have a few up my sleeve, but do we have one from the audience?
Nobody wants to be the first one to ask the question, eh? Remember, there's a book up for grabs here. Best question gets a book. Do you want to fire ahead with one of yours, Terry?
Right, okay. It's quite, I found working as a consultant amongst the many jobs I've had, allows me to get deeply into the way that the board of directors of organizations are thinking about how they're achieving things. And there's lots of things which conflict. One of which is, for instance, the help desk. We're collecting data on products and getting people's details down and having to use the slow systems that have been provided for the money that was paid. And they do not have enough time to answer every phone within 10 rings. And so what they have is huge quantities of data duplication because they're not taking down full details. It's taking a postcode, a name, and maybe nothing else, not even what the problem is. How does one overcome this? I've gone back to the boards and said, you're wasting your money on this. And they haven't believed me. They said the salespeople from whoever they bought the system from convinced us it was working. It does if you go slowly enough.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges that you get, is that there are a lot of quite sharp software vendors who will tell any old tale they can to get a product into an organization, and the reality very often doesn't match the hype. In such a situation, I think one of the things is thinking through about reducing work in progress. So you're not going to be able to turn that around immediately. What you need to be thinking about is saying, okay, where are the problems coming from? How do we actually reduce the work in progress, so that if you've got, we'll go back to the fictional Mrs. Miggins again, so maybe Mrs. Miggins had to ring up 3 or 4 times trying to get a problem solved. If each person has responded to the call, has recorded slightly different details about the problem, and like you say, hasn't necessarily put the right details about where Mrs. Miggins lives, what our customer number is, and so on, it would be impossible to join the dots between them. And so sometimes it actually means you need to take a step back to make sure that people are doing the job right first time, and the data reflects what they have done to allow people to move forward. In some cases, the productivity stats that are used in an organization actually degrade both the service performance and the quality from a data perspective. So I've come across one where early in my career, when I was worked in a large utility, and somebody came with the bright idea of, we'll pay our maintainers a particular rate based on them completing an average of 4 jobs per craftsperson per day. And if at the end of the week they haven't got a 4 jobs per day average, their pay is cut. And so what you typically get is those maintainers who were the highly skilled ones, who've got a lot of experience, were handled the biggest breakdowns that took the longest time to resolve. So therefore, come the end of the week, they had to rush through and do lots of short planned maintenance jobs to try and get their job average up. And recording details about that big breakdown they've done got forgotten about. They knew it should be done. They'd intended to do it, but it got to Friday afternoon, filling in all the feedback, trying to get enough jobs done so they didn't lose out financially. And they think, oh, we'll catch up next week. Sure enough, next week you go through and the same problem happened again. And ultimately, the organization gained a little bit on productivity, but lost massively on the data they were trying to gather. So similarly, I think if you've got metrics that are trying to say, call must be answered in so many rings, the call must be completed within 2 minutes. If somebody's got a slightly harder problem, I mean, we've all been there. We've been on the call, on a call center, trying to get something resolved, and the call magically just cut off just like that. It may be you've been on there a minute 35 seconds, and they've cut you off because they don't want to be penalised for going over 2 minutes. Organisations need to think very carefully about, what are we driving our people to do? If we're measuring them a certain way, that drives certain behaviours. If we're actually truly interested in improving our quality, our efficiency, our productivity, we therefore need to take a step back and actually maybe think about, let's do it right first time, not have lots of work in progress. There are a lot of organisations, financial institutions, councils, etc., can be notorious for this, where each of the many teams, each have got a call centre, each have got a call queue, each one deals with it within their allotted minute or so, and then just pass it on to the next queue. They then pass it on to the next queue. So there's a massive, like point I made earlier about work in progress. You've got a large amount of work in progress, but actually you're not sorting things out. There is one, and I won't put a plug in for the organisation, there's one very good broadband provider where they took a very different approach to their call centre staff. They use staff who are fully trained. They understand what the company does. They are more highly paid than normal for call centre staff. When you bring them up, they're not following a script because they know the job. They have a personable, nice, interesting conversation with you, and they actually get the job done. So you have, rather than going on to a call with them with dread, like you do with most call centres, you go on thinking, oh, it's good, this could be interesting, we're going to get something sorted out. And typically, it gets solved in one call, and you go away without any hassle at all. And that's the kind of approach some organisations need to think through. Coming out of our current weird and wonderful world that we're in at the moment, those organisations that survive are going to be the ones that actually addressing quality, they're addressing efficiency, they're taking waste out of the organization. Poor data quality doesn't have to be normality. It's something that people can take out of an organization. It's inefficiency, it's loss of productivity, it's a loss of profit. So deal with those issues, improve your performance and your profitability.
Yes, touch with the old gold rats in
Yep.
terms of, yes, getting rid of the weakest links.
Yeah.
Right. Is there anybody else fighting for that?
Yeah.
Hello? Any other questions? Oh, it's very quiet out there. Hello?
Yeah, so just type your questions in there. Remember, the book up for grabs for the best question. So maybe let's get examples there. Maybe if somebody wants to put in an example from a current project or a current program they're working on, of that's without naming any names, why don't you put some examples of poor data practice that have caused them headaches in their day job? Terry puts his glass on to see the questions.
Oh, screen print size is rather small. Right. Morris, can you see any questions? It's all very quiet.
Oh, hi, Terry. Hi, yes, I can see some questions. So Asim has asked, is there a silver bullet for an ETL process that can achieve 100% success?
100% success on ETL. Yeah, I think all of these things, you need to think very, very carefully. First, you understand you've got to have a very clear understanding of the specification of the data requirements of the target system. You need to understand the quality of the input data. And very similar to a data migration project, you need to do a lot of testing, doing the ETL process to make sure not just that, so I think ETL is very similar to data migration, where actually it's a business process supported by technology. And thinking about the rules about in this situation, then do this with the data. Those are things that techies who might say, actually all these data fields look the same, we'll stuff them into this field on the receiving system, then not realizing they're corrupting it, they've done their job, they've just moved data from point A to point B, not realizing they've degraded the quality in the process. So it actually needs to be thought through as a business process that's planned through and thought through fairly carefully to make sure that it's delivering what's expected for the organization.
Yeah. Very good.
Right, okay. I've got another question from James, who asks, who in the project team is responsible for maintaining quality relevant data from multiple sources?
I think it's the quality is actually everybody has got a responsibility. So assuming that somebody else is going to sort out your quality problems later is not sensible, because they might get it wrong. Everybody's got a part to play. Everybody will be in a position where they will recognize when something is wrong. They'll recognize that I don't have a full head of ginger hair, for example, so therefore the data isn't accurate. And therefore everybody's got a part to play. But it's down to the project manager, the program manager. They have to set the environment where they are both empowering and enabling people, making sure they have the right skills to make sure the data is right. They're making sure the performance metrics are right to drive the right behaviors. And also they need to be out doing the right kind of questioning. So if maybe using an IT change example, if somebody goes through and says, we want to upgrade software product X, we think it's going to cost us £100,000, it's going to give us 50,000 a year benefits. So you think 2-year payback, yeah, we'll do that. The thing is, the costs might have a huge amount of variability. Your payback, 50,000 a year, that's a very round number. It sounds like somebody's made that up. And so if people are letting that kind of, if you like, poor planning go through, then it perpetuates it. If somebody instead is asking the question, okay, you said the cost is 100,000. What's the sensitivity of that? What's the quality of the data that went up for that? It may well be it's 80% is vendor's cost, which might be locked in, and you've got 20% of your organizational cost. That 20%, it might have plus or minus 50% because there are uncertainties around the data migration. So there's a lot of things that you need to think through about how do you actually drive the right kind of behaviours within the organisation to actually get the right behaviours around data, and then you get the right quality of the data. If the quality is there, then everybody can see how the project or the program is performing. So there's a far clearer view of whether you're on target or not, and whether you're actually achieving the targets you set for yourselves.
That's good.
Yep.
Any others?
Great. Got another question from John Baker, who, and I thought there would be an Agile related question. So he says, how does it work with Agile Scrum?
Good question. I think this is where the worlds of software and data start to diverge from each other. So I think software, there is what I term a sprint mindset. It's do something quick, rush on to the next thing, have a nice party because you've done something that looks flashy, and off you go. The data world, we've got a more of a marathon mindset. We're recognizing that we've got something, we're going to be creating data, it's going to be existing for many, many years to come. And I think the tension comes where you've got that challenge between the very quick agile mindset of do something quick, sort of let it fail, fix it, move on, refine, reiterate, a sort of very agile process, to that longer term process around what you're trying to preserve. And so I think the tension there is how do you actually get the balance right? There need to be some things where you need to say that for these activities, for these aspects of what we're talking about, the quality of the data is absolutely imperative. So therefore, we need to make sure the data specification, the standards are right first time. There might be other things about, we know the entities that we need to record, we know what the IDs are that we can properly identify them, but the attributes about those entities are a bit more variable. So that might be an area where the more fixed approach to how we define the entities, and particularly if we've got identifiers, we make sure they can link to the same identifier in other systems in the organization. And then you allow maybe some more freedom around the attributes that you use. So if we identified a particular new process, maybe if we've got these three attributes will help us define a particular activity or a customer in a way that supports this piece of software developing. And so I think that is where there's a bit of a tension there of trying to get that recognition of the long-term need of how you keep things going and the short-term need to deliver something quickly and fix it and move on to the next one. I think also, and a number of times in my career, I find it amazing that we all think we know how well things work. 6 months can be a long time. 6 years is a hugely amount of time. So you might find that 6 months on from doing something, you go back and look at what you did and think, why did you do that way? And then if maybe you go on 6 years on and the people who did something originally are no longer within the organization, and somebody is there trying to forensically say, why did they code it this way? Where's the documentation? I can't find anything there. All these things last a lot longer than you anticipate within organizations. So therefore you need to start the journey recognizing it's going to last a long time. So not only have we got to create some software artifacts, we've also got to create the supporting documentation to make sure they work. We also need to make sure the data that is both an input to and is created by what the tool we're creating is actually going to be fit for purpose, going to survive long enough to support the business for as long as it needs it.
That's good.
Okay, so next question.
So I'm not sure if you've done this one already, but how has the perception of data value changed with the rise of big data and AI? And that's from William Hooper. Sorry.
I think that's a really good question. I think it goes back to the point I made about people having a belief that software will solve your data problems. So just because somebody's got a data science thing, if they've got an AI tool, it can guess, it can try and learn from, it can try and get some insights in terms of the data that you've got. And if it's just a case of most of the data is there and you've got a couple of gaps in a time series trend, then it's probably relatively safe if you've only got small gaps to use machine learning, use AI to fill in that gap. If on the other hand, you've maybe only got one reading in 10, trying to infer forecast what was in that gap gets to be a very, very dangerous perspective. And so I think all of these things is that there needs to be a balance between using the tools correctly and being very savvy about it. I think the term I like to use for things like that is decision support tools. So they should be the tools there that are used as an aid to a human being making a decision. So if they suggest the answer as X, and somebody with that subject matter expertise I mentioned earlier from the data triangle looks at it and then says, actually, that's not plausible. We need to go back and do some more analysis. So rather than it being a nice, what looked like a nice answer, somebody using their experience, using their wisdom, using their knowledge they've gained over many years in a particular domain, might be able to spot something and think, actually, no, that's not a safe thing to do. Or let's do it in a slightly different way, so we're not risking a lot of the budget of the organisation. So I think, yeah, that for me is quite a key thing, is trying to just be a little bit savvy on that. AI work, many years ago, I was involved in the commissioning of a rules-based artificial intelligence system for program planning and forecasting. So it was doing a lot of investment modeling, and it worked on the basis of if this, then that. Sounds simple, but what nobody had appreciated when the project was initiated was both the sheer complexity of the decision logic. It ended up being thousands of rules, and managing and maintaining those rules was a nightmare. And secondly, nobody appreciated the impact of data quality on all of those rules. So although a lot of money was spent trying to improve the quality of the data, it still was not good enough for the rules to deliver the anticipated output. So it ended up being a very, very expensive calculating engine. And the area where it actually delivered the most value was where you got the most repeatability. It was a load of facilities that all came with about, let's say, about 8 different types of combination. And the data that was fed in, thinking about the condition of the asset, the costs, the rate of degradation, actually came out with some quite good forecasts. But for the sites that were much bigger, and each one being a lot more bespoke, the AI just really, really struggled. So I think it's all about being very, very savvy. I think for anything like this, you need to try and make sure you're being an intelligent buyer rather than being sold to by the flashy salesman, if that makes sense.
Yes, it definitely does. That's great. So the next question is from Elias Kaseya, who says, or who asks, what has to be done for senior management to use the collected organized data effectively for better decision making?
I think the world is slowly changing on this, and I think there is a greater recognition about both what good data can do for an organization and the pitfalls of the data isn't fit for purpose. So that's why the role of the chief data officer, or CDO, is starting to become much more prevalent within organizations, because people have realized that the software, the CIO, the CTO role is just looking at the technology. It's using a warehouse analogy. They created the warehouse, they put the shelves and the racking in there, but they're not bothered what's on the shelves as long as they're not overloaded. It's a business decision about what you put on the shelves and how you use them. And so I think there is an interesting hybrid there. And the organizations that do better are the ones that have recognized that software is the enabler, but it isn't the whole answer. That the software needs to work with the data and with a bit of wisdom to achieve the right outputs. And so part of that is trying to get organizations, and particularly the leaders, to be a bit more savvy about understanding that this is about profit, it's about efficiency, it's about service quality, this is about how we actually deliver what we're doing as an organization. So we therefore need to make sure we're doing it right as much as we can. And recognizing that one of the things I mentioned earlier about doing maturity assessments, one of the things that I regularly get asked before we do a maturity assessment is when a client has a fear that what we're going to recommend is that you need to buy expensive software system X plus expensive software system Y and huge amount of consultancy on top of it to make it all work. For most organizations, 90% of the time, our recommendations are things that can be done or things the organization can do now. It's things like getting the data stewards across the organization clarifying, what do we expect you to do as a data steward? How do we actually get you talking to each other so you have what I term a data discussion? So somebody in one customer service team talking to a service fulfillment person talking to somebody else might realize actually we're all trying to use the same data, and if this team can get in a slightly different format, then we can all gain from that. Those conversations have a huge amount of power within an organization. having a central team that is the CDO and maybe a small team supporting them is a very powerful way of actually moving things forward. Because what you can have is a case where, unlike IT, where you tend to have a department that's got quite a large monolithic structure, where you've got your help desk team, where you've got your database analyst team, where you've got your networking, your hardware team, you've got your developers. The CDO, the data role, is a lot more about networking the people who are already doing these kind of things across the organization. So again, message for senior management is that, similar to the strapline on the screen here, is data doesn't have to be difficult. It's about joining the dots. It's about starting those conversations, not just at data steward level, but also at senior management level. Your data governance board is a good way of getting directors and senior level people across the organization in a room on a regular basis, or in a virtual room these days, talking about data. If you've got performance metrics about the quality of the data, that makes it a more informed discussion. But if somebody in customer relations and somebody in service fulfillment and somebody in procurement are saying, actually, we've got a real problem with this supplier, it's causing these problems downstream, and people can start to understand how that fits, just having that conversation alone is starting to change the way things work and actually starting to deliver a benefit. So yeah, it's about recognizing that it can be done without massive investment. It can be done in a very organic way, starting small, building up. It doesn't necessarily involve sort of a big bang approach. And one of the bits I didn't put in today's presentation was about thinking about how you actually implement a better approach to data quality management in an organization. So you could do it where you've got a whole team who are taken offline. They write a whole load of standards, procedures, policies. They come up with a whole load of tooling, a load of processes to follow, and then they launch on the organization. Whilst they've been doing all that planning, no benefits to the organization, but a lot of cost. And then when they get to the end result of that, and then saying, right, we now all want you to do it this way, you've got yet another business change problem, business transformation problem to go through. If, on the other hand, you start small, you say, right, let's just start doing this. Let's put a few metrics in place. Let's measure what we're doing. Let's do a few tweaks in there. Now let's add some more quality metrics. Now let's put a bit of specification of our data requirements in this area. You're starting in a much more organic way, and you're delivering benefits from day one, and you're taking your staff with you on the journey. And if they understand a bit more about data and why it's important, they also then not just become part of the solution, but they actually start to be self-sustaining. They start to have their own ideas. We've had a few organizations we've worked with where as soon as you show people, this is the way you're currently doing your data, this is your current process, they're straight away thinking, why are we doing it like that? Why can't we just go from this team to that team? That's, well, I don't know, because that's the way your current process works. And once they realize that, they're off. They're starting to generate their own ideas, and that is a much more sustainable, future-proof approach for an organization. Terry's got his finger up there.
Yes, question, if it's the ground is clear. AI relies on data and analysis of data, but some of the analysis of data is correlational rather than causational.
Yeah.
So what is your view on this and the safety of using data which is just correlated?
Okay, well, I think you probably all have heard the old garbage in, garbage out analogy.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things I'm seeing these days is actually garbage in, gospel out. So people are putting lousy data into a state-of-the-art dashboard system, and they think that's going to tell them wondrous things about their organization, and they believe it because it's presented by a state-of-the-art dashboard. It's got pretty graphs, you can dive in, you can slice, dice, drive up, down, filter, whatever. But if the underlying data is poor, you're making bad decisions. I think that's one of the challenges we've got, is that people sometimes get swayed by a tool with a flashy graphic rather than actually going to the underlying thing and saying, let's just make sure we're doing this right first. Let's make sure we've got the measures right before we start implementing anything too expensive and flashy. So yeah, I think the problem can come where people are putting too much trust in something because it's come from either we've spent a fortune on that system, or it's our new data lake, so therefore everything's going to be wonderful, or it's this particular dashboard, and I won't name names, but you'd be familiar with the kind of dashboards that are out there. People trust it implicitly rather than recognizing it's the same data that went into the spreadsheet you didn't trust. it just looks prettier. So why are you suddenly trusting it now? And it's again, it's a behavioral thing of getting people to be skeptical of just because the data looks better, is it better? Are you asking the right questions about where did that data come from? What's the quality of the incoming data? What's the sensitivity of the algorithm to that quality? So yeah, it's about being a bit more savvy and about actually being skeptical about what you're doing. And again, I don't have a downer on software. I have a downer on people poorly implementing software and over trusting it because they think it will solve all their problems.
Yep. Thank you.
Nice.
Well, Maurice, anybody else in the queue?
Yes, we've got a few more. So David says, surely data validation modules in Agile need not be sidelined. They can be prioritized so that they're not relegated to allow weak design and rush testing. It just needs the management at all levels to recognize this.
Yeah, and I think that's about, again, it's about trying to have that bit more of a marathon mindset. So rather than saying, I want to have a new iteration of the product by the end of the month, of being able to see that it is part of a journey and that what is created will be an asset for the organization. What is created will create data that is an enabler and an asset for the organization. If people don't understand the data and how it relates to everything else, then you've got a real problem. So one of the challenges many organizations have got is they have something called master data management because they have so many different versions of the truth, so many different representations of the customer, and they're trying to pull them all together to make sense of it. Now, software can help, but some of these master data management packages are A, hugely expensive, B, very difficult to implement, and C, they're unnecessary because actually, in effect, what you're doing is you're putting a sticking plaster over the fact that you didn't actually properly link everything up in the first place. So having an enterprise architecture view up front of thinking conceptually, if we've got a customer as a concept, if we're doing something agile, something clever, where we're involving the customer, we need customer information. Let's use the same customer information. Let's link it with the existing customer information we've got. Let's repeat the IDs so that we've got that one consistent view of the customer because it's an enabler for future things. Yeah. Yes, it might slow people down a little bit, but actually that is the right thing to do because it means that what you're creating not just is maybe something flashy at the end of the month to meet whatever target that you've got, but you're actually creating something that's got a longer term sustainable value that's going to help be an asset to the organization and not a liability. Hopefully that makes sense there. But I know this agile sort of waterfall, sort of slow, fast mindset, it is attention is one thing that I think we're never going to get 100% right, but I think the more people that take a more enlightened approach who can understand the trade-offs and think actually, yes, from a business imperative, we need to have something that's customer facing by a particular date, recognizing that maybe there are some data shortcuts being taken and there's going to be something put in place to tidy them up afterwards and they deliver on that. That's the kind of conversation the organization should be having, is how do they just make sure that some of the decision makers are just a little bit more data literate, data savvy, and less trusting that software can fix everything.
Great. So a kind of a related question to that is from Christiane, who says, well, if data is so important, why is it taking business leaders so long to care about the data going into systems?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think one of the behaviours I didn't explain in the data zoo is something like the data ostrich. So they could be somebody who's maybe very senior in their role, they've been there a long time, they've got a lot of experience, but they haven't got the IT skills. So they rely on gut instinct and intuition to get there. But the other one, which is I think now more prevalent these days, is the alpha, I would say alpha male, but some of them are women, but you get the alpha manager type who is very dictatorial. It is gut feel says we go that way, now go and get the data to prove it was the right decision. And I think that is one of the challenges that you've got is trying to get people to take the right approaches towards the data is quite difficult. And I think particularly if people are starting on the journey and they have an organization where the legacy is poor and the management drive is saying just make a decision quickly and move on to the next thing. There are quite a few organizations I've come across where people know things are being done wrong, but they also know that every 6 months, every year, there's a reorganization. So hopefully I'll get reorganized and moved into a new role before the real problems start coming to light. So it is a bit of a problem. I think again, using the turning the supertanker analogy, for most organizations, the amount of data that they have got, it means that you can't pirouette, you can't do a 180-degree turn in a month or two. Our challenge as data professionals is to actually try and make sure we've turned the rudder, we can demonstrate the rudder has turned in the right direction, we can potentially demonstrate that the ship is starting to turn, and we then just have to let time allow the ship to turn. And so I think there is, again, it's being a bit more enlightened about how quickly some of these things can be done. Hopefully that makes sense anyway.
So I think we've just got time for 2 more questions. So apologies to anybody who's asked a question that I haven't got to. So Sally asks, have you any tips for exploiting teams' actual data habits in order to improve a system? So the example she gives is having a consistent practice of adding useful data, for example, a date to free text titles.
Ooh, yeah. Okay, I'll use an analogy from early in my career when I was doing some consultancy work. Went to work for an organization where it was an asset-based organization, and they had a field to record year of construction. It was a free text field. So what happened was that in some cases people put a date in there. It might have been in a US format. In some cases it was a UK format. In some cases it got slashes rather than dashes to delimit the different bits of the date. There was also text appearing there of 1950s, 1960s, 1950s stroke 1960s, old, now demolished. There's a whole range of different bits of text in there. And the problem was that because it was a text field, people could put anything in there. Each individual record case, a human being looking at it could actually understand and interpret what was there and probably get the right interpretation about roughly how old the asset was. However, if you're trying to process the data on 1 million assets and you've got free text of that nature, you can't process it. And so that's the problem, is that I think free text should be the absolute last resort. If you're working in a system where, or an environment where IT are being awkward, or you haven't got the budget maybe to make the changes that you would like, then provide guidance so people know how they're supposed to fill in a field if they're using free text correctly. Secondly, start reporting immediately on the quality of the data that's being created so that you know as soon as you can. And then going back to the analogy there about health and safety analogy, you need to get the feedback loop as short as you can. So if somebody's doing something wrong, they need to be pulled up on it and sort of made sure they do the right thing as quickly as they can. So a little bit like if you've got teenage children and they leave dirty clothes all around the house and dirty crockery, and you as the parent keep putting the crockery in the dishwasher, you put the clothes in the washing machine and go, their learned behavior is, we don't have to put anything away because mum or dad will put it away for us and they'll sort it all out. If on the other hand, you're challenging them and saying, no, you can't do X until you put your clothes away or put the dirties in the dishwasher, they start to learn that actually mum and dad are going to be on my case, they're going to be a right pain, so I want a quiet life, I'll just put it in the dishwasher anyway. So similarly, from a data perspective, if you're doing your checks quickly and promptly, and you're challenging somebody, right, you know this record you put in yesterday, you didn't fill it in correctly. Do you know what the correct data was? They know you're on the case. So they might start to behave their behavior. And then as soon as you keep repeating it, they will start to change their behavior. But more importantly, because you've gone back quite quickly after the thing was done wrong, they may be able to remember what they should have put in the first place. So it may well be that, actually, yeah, when I spoke to Mrs. Miggins, she got a problem with this. I know I didn't type it in there, but yeah, I can type it in now. If you wait 6 months, they can't remember what they've done. 6 months is too late. People are going to say, oh, I can't remember what I did that day. And they'll take a chance of thinking, actually, yeah, I'm not bothered doing the data because I only get called up once every 6 months, so it's not a problem. I'm not going to do it. So if you have got to use free text fields, it's a last resort. So you need to make sure, clearly specify, report on it, and then challenge the people who aren't doing what you expect them to do. Hopefully that makes sense.
Great. I know I said 2 last questions, but I think with the time being what it is, that should end our questions, and I should hand back to Terry to do some wrapping up.
Thank you very much, Morris. You've been great support, and
Thank you.
couldn't have done it without you. Now we're back to Julian. prize winner.
Yes, indeed. Various questions there. I like Sally's question there, but I think the one that for me, I think was a good thought-provoking one, a good, well thought through question was one from John Beach, if I got the name right, about the senior level changes. So hopefully I recorded and remembered the name correctly. But yeah, I think John should get a book.
Is John still there to acknowledge?
Well, presumably they're between Kerry and the organisers should have the details behind the scenes somewhere.
That's brilliant. Thank you. So I'll make a note, John Beach, dropping pens on the floor. Never mind, I'll come back to that later. Thank you, thank you, Julian. Thank you, Morris. Thank you, audience, members. If you're not a member, please join. Come along to our AGM next month on the, what is it, 17th? And, sorry, wrong, 21st. And enjoy yourself there and vote for me and vote for other people as well. But again, don't forget Julian's talk tomorrow as well. And thank you all. Time to say good night. Happy dreams, creamy cakes, and pink ice creams, as the nursery rhyme book used to say. God bless.
Yep, thank you all.
Thank you.